All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes, the show where we dig into the stories of the people shaping the future of app-based computing with a special focus on mobile. I'm your host, Matt Klein, co-founder and CTO of Bitdrift, as well as the founder of Envoy Proxy. Each episode will talk with engineers, founders, and technical leaders who transform the way their companies build and understand what's happening inside their systems. We'll dig into the challenges, the breakthroughs, the lessons learned, and we'll wrap it all up with their hottest takes. So let's dive in. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Brian Chambers, who, in his own words, is a guy who does stuff and sometimes it works. He is the chief architect at Chick-fil-A. He's the co-founder of Edge Monsters and the Chief Architect Network. And he also moonlights as the CIO and CTO for a nonprofit doing community economic development, using business to help alleviate poverty in Latin America. Brian, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hey, Matt. Pleasure to be here.
I'm excited for this episode because I think a lot of people out there may not know about all of the cool technology that a company like Chick-fil-A does. And I think it'll be exciting to dig into that. So thank you again. How I typically start is I would love to learn a little more about you and how you got to where you are today. And you're an interesting case, I think, in the modern world of tech where people tend to move around every couple of years. You've been at Chick-fil-A, I think, for almost 20 years, and you're now the chief architect. So I just love to learn a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, happy to share. So I've been at Chick-fil-A for, it's coming up on 22 years, actually, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know that's abnormal. I started straight out of college and I've been thinking about this, reflecting back a little bit lately. I think I kind of came out of college like not really being good at anything, and I could write some SQL queries, maybe do like a little programming. And I think the early part of my career was sort of just like figuring out who I was and how to do stuff and build a lot of confidence. And so a lot of my early roles, I think, were just like getting exposed to the real world of technology. And like in hindsight, I would say, I think I had enough humility because I felt some of those things I mentioned. Like I didn't think I was really great at anything. I thought maybe even like I wasn't good enough to do this as a job and I should do something else early on. But I think that let me learn from a lot of experiences early in my career. And I think we could go into the details if you want to know more about what I did early. But I think for me, like the pivotal time was probably, 10 years in. That's about when kind of our modern cloud era started. And I was really lucky, I would say, to be in a position where I got the opportunity to be part of leading the way that we embraced cloud and a lot of the other things that come with that at Chick-fil-A and help shape the way that we approached it. It was conveniently timed in that we had to solve some new problems at Chick-fil-A that everybody's familiar with, like going into digital order channels and things like that, having the Chick-fil-A One application. So we had some new problems that made cloud make sense. And we got to think about like, what does it look like to do things differently in the company? And so I was kind of like well placed to be part of that. And I think I was part of the architecture team that we had, kind of like a centralized architecture approach at Chick-fil-A. It always has been since it's existed. I got to be a part of leading that, and I think it positioned me well. I got to develop as a person. I got to learn a lot. I got to do a lot of hands-on things that I had never had the chance to do in my career before, and maybe just like wasn't really into coming up. I don't have the like computer tinkerer backstory. Like I was more of a outdoorsy, sportsy kid. But I think I became a nerd in that time range, really, and got like really passionate about how the tech worked, bottom to top, and invested a lot of time myself in figuring things out, both inside and outside of work. And anyway, all that I think positioned me to be in a good spot when there was an opportunity to become the leader of architecture for the organization, to be a pretty good fit. And so certainly feel still lucky and fortunate to have had that opportunity. But I think if I could say a couple things I did well, I think it was just like investing in myself and spending time learning things I didn't really have to learn because of curiosity. And like ultimately that paid off to a large extent. So feel free to dig in anywhere you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great story. I think where I'd love to start is I think people out there, I think many of them have just never thought quite honestly about how much technology, at least in the modern era, is involved in actually running a restaurant chain like Chick-fil-A. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a huge amount of technology. And if you fast forward to today, just from an end user perspective, my my wife is actually always complimenting Chick-fil-A. She's like, wow, it's like you got the app and it goes in and you go through the drive-through line and, everything is all magical and all of that. And I think given that you've been there for so long, maybe on the way of taking us through some of the cool technology that has been built, I think you keyed on the first thing that I'd love to learn about is you were there, I think, through a transition, right? Where things went to being app driven. Like people now expect there to be an app and to do online ordering and all of those things. And that obviously was not the case when you started, right? So even just to rewind a bit, like from maybe some of the stuff that you worked on early on, and I guess, like you were there for that transition, right? From that transition to, I would say, like typical restaurant style operations where there's still certainly technology involved, but to the modern era of like, as you said, like digital ordering and apps and all of those things. And, I would love to learn a little bit, even going back in time, even 10 years, where you were saying that you got the opportunity to actually, start working on some of the cloud focused digital initiatives. I guess like what were the problems back then, that people were actually attempting to solve, and then maybe that's a good way of starting to dig into some of the technology that's actually been built.
Yeah, a lot of problems. I mean, so if I go back to the beginning of my career at Chick-fil-A, these are fun stories. Well, back then we didn't take credit cards in stores. It was all cash and checks. If anybody remembers what those are.
Really?
So
Even
22 years
even in
ago,
the time frame that we're
yeah,
talking about.
22 years
No.
ago, no credit cards.
Wow. Okay.
Dial-up internet at all restaurants. So if
Amazing.
you
All right.
wanted to get data from a restaurant about something that they entered, which we have to for a bunch of reasons, always have, that required like them double clicking on an app on their Windows desktop, and then the modem noise, doo 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 doo, all that fun, and then like it would send things across using, believe it or not, I don't know if you ever worked with Sybase databases back in the day, but there were Sybase databases in the store, and then a consolidated version actually in our office building. And so we would like replicate, do outputs from the transaction logs from the local databases, ship that stuff up and apply it to a consolidated database, and then like ETL downstream from there. So that's like the lay of the land from a restaurant's
Wow.
systems
Okay.
perspective. When I arrived, was a lot of like client server-y type stuff, but the way that data moved around the organization was like over dial-up internet connections, to the data center on the second floor of our office building, which is crazy.
And would people would they do the dial up every night, or were they instructed to like every hour they would do a sync job or
They
something
did
like
it.
that?
They did it certain times of the day that were usually triggered by like the end of a shift. So they would they'd run we called it the daily transmission though. So they would run the daily transmission and send all that stuff up. And then one of my early roles at Chick-fil-A was actually, I mentioned I was pretty good with like SQL and databases and stuff. So that was a big part of our restaurant architecture. So that worked out well. But I also did a lot of like escalated support stuff in my first couple of years. And so if you needed to do something like on the computer, like check something out, there was no real observability, right? There was no real easy way to get a view. So you actually had to call the operator and ask them to run the daily transmission while you ran a ping against their IP. And when it showed up and started responding, you're like, boom, remote desktop. So pretty fun, old school. But yeah, that's kind of the world that we came from. And so kind of, moving towards what sorts of problems. I mean, it was like, we wanted to be able to take credit cards because obviously that's where the world has gone. And then like, as we've stepped into, the kind of 10 or 12 year ago timeline, I think the big thing is as mobile became a thing was you wanted to be able to engage customers in the way that they're thinking and what's normal for them. And I wouldn't say we were on the leading edge of that at all. Like we came a little bit later, but we wanted that app experience, I guess, to be like a good representation of Chick-fil-A's brand, to be a great experience, to be an easy place to order, to be a place for restaurant operators to be able to connect with their customers and things like that. And so a big driver of that was just like that was a new kind of scale. Like we dealt with thousands of users typically at most. And when you get into the world of customers, the scale need goes up dramatically into the millions of users that want to use your app. And so we had many times that we did things that I'm sure you can go back and find articles, but we tried to do things with old paradigms and they broke. And embracing cloud was where we were able to successfully scale. And, everybody has their issues still, but been a much smoother journey ever since that. So those are some of the big things I would say that kind of stand out.
But I would imagine too that, there's two sides, right? There's obviously the customer app side of things, like the people that are doing their digital ordering and all of those things. But I would imagine too that over time you have another side of it, which is you're investing in the technology within the restaurants themselves. And I don't know much about this, but you started out by talking about how you don't take credit cards and people are uploading data on a dial-up modem and all of those things. I would imagine that there are things that can be understood and gleaned from having more real-time access and understanding what's going on in like the back of the house situation, like what's happening in the kitchens or in the operations and all of those things. So I think, did these efforts happen in parallel, or when you're talking about kind of like modernizing the entire infrastructure, does it all go together in terms of how, both customers are interacting with the system as well as how, the employees are actually interacting with the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a journey for us. So it's kind of like lots of small steps forward over time that have changed the system. So it wasn't like there was one dramatic moment where everything changed all at once and forever. But I do feel like, we had a period where we talked about like mobile first, just meaning like we're going to contemplate, should an experience be mobile over, a traditional web app. This is obviously after we moved away from a lot of the client server stuff, but in kind of that modern era, we had a lot of web apps at Chick-fil-A, but we started to ask questions like mobile first, for in-restaurant systems as well as staff-facing things, for our corporate staff. And then we kind of got into this chapter that was asking ourselves like sort of like cloud first, paradigm. So I think we've kind of gone through some different periods where we've kind of changed fundamentally how we're thinking, but a lot of these systems have just sort of, I'm thankful Chick-fil-A is a company that embraces like technology opportunities as they come. And again, maybe not always the first to do everything. And I don't think that's even necessary, but I think we've embraced a lot of the paradigm changes, not with like, we're holding on to, the mainframe world and we're scared to touch it. But I feel like we've modernized pretty intentionally over the years and like it's happened periodically, like step by step, not like all at once, or we change, completely the way that we operate or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, you keep talking about that you weren't the first to do a lot of these things, but again, I'm speaking from a customer perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I obviously don't know what happens in the back of the house of the restaurants, but from a customer perspective, your technology is very good. I mean, at least compared to other competitors that I might go to. And I think what I want to understand from that is, do you think that there's some benefit in being a little bit later to the adoption curve and like, I don't know, like understanding how other people have done it and like how they failed? Or do you think that you all have just executed very well? I guess what I'm asking is like, how do you think that you have wound up with a system that works well?
Yeah. I think it's a number of factors, Matt. Like, I think there's an element where you can get excited about the technology because it lets you do something, but like organizationally or customer adoption wise or different things like that, like the timing may not be right. So I've never felt like we have been quick to rush into things that we could do and that might be awesome, but that we weren't fully ready to do. So that means like other people have, been ahead of us in some of these digital areas, but that's why I keep saying I think it's okay. I think what we did well is we've acted at the time when we had the right organizational support for whatever the thing was that we were doing. Like people were really bought in and were working together. So you didn't have I don't think we had a lot of like obstacles. I mean, there's always disagreements on how to get things done, but I don't think we had a lot of the obstacles, that could exist. And we did get to learn some things about the industry or, what made sense to do. It could have been customer, learning from other people's customer experiences, or it could have just been internal facing things for our operators, having more time to get feedback, having more time for things to develop and be able to tell stories about what could be and kind of aim at the right stuff. So I think some of it is just like a little bit of patience. It's still sometimes risk taking too. Like it may or may not work, but I think the patient side of it, reflecting on it, I think that can be really valuable. Just like wait till it feels like that time is right, as opposed to needing to be on the front because somebody else, did a thing. And I see that sometimes right now, I guess, with some of the AI stories that are out there, or like, huge computer vision deployments or things like that, where, maybe those things would be really great, but I don't know that like rushing into some of them, especially when they're really big investments, is always like the right thing for us. So I think we've been good about, are we going to get the value out of what we're doing? And then execution wise, like, I think we've done a pretty good job at that, I would say, just as an observer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know personally much about the restaurant industry, but I do recall reading an article recently about, I forget who it was. Someone was trying some AI ordering system and like it didn't work and they had to roll it back or something like that. And I don't actually want to get into that, but I think it's more, I think from a technology perspective, there's always a balance that we have to strike about working on shiny, cool things, like versus what's doing actually right for the customers.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you all have struck a pretty good balance there.
I feel like that's true. And we have been like maybe on the front end at times. And it's always interesting to see what kind of feedback you get when you do that. Like an example would be one of the things was very close to, which is like our edge computing, cube at the edge in the stores architecture. And like there weren't a lot of people talking about doing that sort of thing at the time. And so we were kind of on the front end, and a lot of people have said they did things that were inspired by, what Chick-fil-A did in that architecture. That's cool. We did that because I think our business had some challenges, operationally, that we thought that could help us solve by getting more connected things, by getting more real-time information to really busy operators and team members. And we have some, you can find all this stuff publicly. Like we have a bunch of volume challenges per restaurant at times because we do a lot more, sales per physical restaurant, site than anybody in the industry by quite a bit. And we do that in 6 days a week instead of 7. So like we're really busy, and that creates certain challenges that make sense for us to think about addressing with technology, where I don't know, I could imagine maybe there's others where they don't have volume problems and this would be crazy for them to bother investing in. Like it just wouldn't be necessary. But for us, those kind of things made sense. So that's why I say I think we're willing to be on the front end with technology when it makes sense and when it's solving a problem that we feel very strongly that we have and we have an idea about how to solve it. But then other times we may be, we may trail a little bit. And I think both of those are perfectly okay. Just got to kind of manage the situation and see what makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would love to dig into that more, for what you can share, mostly because I think many folks that are out there listening, they are used to, I'll use air quotes, modern architectures where, you've got some central system running in your cloud somewhere, and then you've got some apps, right? Like it's a pretty typical architecture. It's like a hub and spoke with your giant fast networking that's running in the middle, and then you've got some problems out. I think, what you all are building is different than what a lot of people are used to, right? Like you obviously, I'm sure, have some services that run in a central location, but you also have what you just said is you have complicated systems that are running in each store. So your architecture is actually substantially more complicated than what a lot of people are dealing with in terms of like a central technology hub. Then you have like distributed technology centers that might not have good connectivity. Then you have people on apps. For what you can share, just to tell people out there, I'd love to learn more just about the technical challenges. So like when you started to talk about, you did this architecture where you're putting the cubes in the restaurants, would love to learn more about like what were the operational problems that you were trying to solve, and like what was that geared towards?
Yeah. So for like from a business side, what were we trying to solve?
Yeah, sure. Or
yeah.
I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, like we're all obviously, or at least we should be solving business problems. But like you were applying technology to solve those problems. I'm just trying to learn more about like what were the technology issues that were blocking the business, that caused you to invest in that. And I think just to help educate the people out there more on on, basically what I was saying, which is that your architecture is different, I think, than what a lot of other people are used to, right? So I think just for people to learn a bit more, like what are the technical challenges, and the business challenges of trying to operate these things, I think would be very interesting.
Yeah, sure. So maybe like I can just quickly say like some of the things are the same. So we'll talk about the edge computing footprint and what we try to solve there. But like I think it's really important for people to know like we don't run everything out of that restaurant because it exists. We have tons of things that are cloud deployed applications, SaaS applications, like a whole bunch of stuff that helps our restaurant operators and team members and things like that. So we intentionally built this edge footprint kind of small and fairly scrappy on purpose because the goal was we're trying to deal with a really small subset of challenges that exist inside of a very busy restaurant environment and especially inside a very busy restaurant kitchen environment. So most of the energy was really about, we have like front of house, we would call it, like where we're serving customers. We have things that, need to interface between front and back being the kitchen. But like a lot of the energy was really about building more restaurant capacity by trying to optimize the existing restaurant footprint that we had. So you got a certain amount of square footage, you got a certain amount of equipment, you can fit a certain amount of humans back there doing work. And then after that, like those physical constraints, the only way you can really improve is if you bring different systems to bear or you juggle the way that those people perform actions, change the workflows, things like that, right? So that was really the goal of the technology, was to help make that kind of change happen in a really busy environment, in a really busy kitchen environment. So some examples that we've talked about, publicly are things like food quality is really important and food safety is really important to us. So taking some of the cognitive load off team members when it came to hold times, for products. So that's a solution, like a business solution for a real problem that we rolled out 8 or 9 years ago to the chain that sat on top of this edge computing solution. So it dealt with like chicken hold times specifically for our different products. There's other things that I can't share as much detail about, but other things that are really about optimizing the way that we make product, because we try and make things as quickly or as close to the customer ordering them as possible without ending up with a really bad speed of service, right? You don't want to wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, for your food. You want to be quick. So there's this balance, delicate balance, right, of product quality. Food safety is like a way downstream concern, but product quality and food safety with speed of service. And so I think those are the kind of things where if you can help humans who are working at capacity as hard as they can, as quick as they can, but having to like mentally juggle a lot of stuff, like they don't see how many people are coming into the dining room and how many cars are in the drive-through. So none of those like signals you might be able to get if you were kind of floating above a store, so to speak. Those people don't know that. They're really going off of a screen that's telling them, here's what you need right now. And then off of their history and then what people are yelling to them that they need to do, because we're holding on fries or whatever. So really a lot of it is about making a better human experience for a worker in the back by taking away some of the things that they would need to be thinking about and sort of like storing in memory in their brain real time as they work, and trying to take those and put them in a place where it's like, you just think about this. Here's what you should do right now. Here's what you should do next. They can always override it. They can always respond to other things, but really trying to help us improve our operational processes by bringing technology as a helper alongside people. So that's kind of the business challenge side of it. Happy to talk about some of the tech challenges that exist when you do that. But
thanks for the context. Would love to dig into the tech challenges. And I think one thing that comes to mind first, which would love to learn more about, is, as you said already, you have services and stuff that runs in the cloud. I would assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that, you want some code to run in the restaurants because you're worried about connectivity issues or reliability issues or those kinds of things. And that's actually what I'd love to learn more about.
Yeah.
Like how do you decide, right? Like which portions of the experience run in the cloud, which things run locally? Because again, I'm just speaking from an architecture perspective, I would imagine the more stuff that you run in an autonomous basis in the restaurants, it adds a lot of complexity because now you have to sync stuff back and forth and do all this stuff, right? So, it seems like you'd have to be really intentional about like what code you run there versus what you run up in the cloud. And I'm just trying to learn more about like
absolutely.
how do you make those decisions? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy first thing is we would say default to cloud if you can. And if you can is going to be a function of ultimately user experience, right? Like there's some things that we always are just going to do in the cloud, like the web application stuff that people need to do, like payroll related things and all these kinds of services, right? It just makes sense. Just default to the cloud on those. Then you've got things that are like you really need the cloud to do them, like processing payments. You can't process a payment fully locally because it typically goes back to some, credit processor, Visa, American Express, whatever. But you can do things like store and forward, if you're offline and process later and you decide if you want to take the risk of it could be declined and you gave something away, like that's just reality. So we've got, situations like that. And you got things that like you just don't ever want them to not work, like point of sale. We've always been very intentional that we don't have cloud dependencies or really out of restaurant dependencies on point of sale. There's been some, but they always have like payment has, store and forward. If you have something that's a real-time dependency outside of the restaurant, there's typically like a graceful degradation state, like something stored locally that may not be quite as good, but good enough, those kinds of things. So there's sort of this spectrum. Our thought on a lot of the things that we did in the kitchen was we're going to be dealing with a lot of data and a lot of signals coming from different places. So that's like computer vision, small computer vision deployment, not like we're looking at everything everywhere, but small computer vision deployment, a ton of IoT connected devices. So like pretty much all of our kitchen equipment is connected and sending out data in real time, pretty much always over MQTT. So like our edge is a hub for that. So like our thesis with the edge computing stack that we built was if there's things that are truly going to move the needle on our restaurant's capacity and if we're going to do them, they should be important enough to the people that if they're gone, that's a problem. We probably don't want to depend on, connectivity being available, round trip connectivity being available. And we want to be able to run those things like very quickly with low latency in any condition, where the restaurant has power basically, because they're like food production, running the core business related. So I think that's kind of like the spectrum in terms of how we think about it is, can it run somewhere else and get tolerable user experience? If so, then that's probably pretty good. But some of these things that are core to the operations, taking orders, taking payment, running kitchen operations, doing things in the drive-through, like those are things that we want to make sure those always work because that's like, not only is it user experience for the person behind the app, but like it's customer experience stuff, right? Like if our stuff breaks there, you come to Chick-fil-A and you don't get a good experience. We have to turn you away or, we have to wait a long time or something. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So I think that's how we think about it from a logical perspective.
Yeah. I mean, lots of people love to talk about their disaster, different mechanisms that, that they use. And I think a lot of people talk about them, but don't actually test them. And one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about all of that is like, do you regularly cut the internet to a restaurant to see if it works? Like, how do you know if it's actually going to work if you lose connectivity?
Yeah, we don't do it to real stores because it's disruptive, especially with like digital orders in now. Like connectivity has become increasingly important, I think, in the quick service restaurant business compared to historically. So we've got like backup connections now too, but they're slower, usually cell or something like that. But yeah, we have tested those types of conditions plenty of times, and they happen to us in the real world like all the time.
Right.
Stores are offline at any given time because a fiber line, to the store got cut by construction or whatever. So we get the kind of the chaos engineering done by the world instead of by us on a pretty regular basis across 3,500 plus locations. But I did want to go back to something you said, which is the word complexity. And I do think when you think about what happens at the edge, whatever edge is, for a listener, it could be our kind where it's sort of like on-prem to a restaurant, or it could be like on mobile device or whatever. I do think the further away you get from like the central point of control, the more your complexity can kind of compound in cost and like difficulty to support potential for things to go wrong. So like while people might say, well, you obviously aren't thinking about complexity if you're running Kubernetes clusters in 3,500 locations, but say we definitely are. Like our approach to that was really like very strongly opinionated about keeping the footprint minimal. Like the reason for Cube being there was great open source ecosystem around it, and we needed to schedule containerized workloads to run across multiple nodes. Like we didn't need to do a lot of really cute stuff. There's some great things built in, that we can help with secrets management and other stuff, but like we didn't want to make something super complex. We don't do much with like data persistence at the edge. Like we don't make a lot of guarantees. We do a lot of caching and like hydrate, like rehydrate from the cloud, send things out when you can. Like we made trade-offs. I think this is like really hard for people, but like we made a bunch of trade-offs that I could talk about, like no service levels on durability of storage at the edge. We don't do like a distributed file system at the store, no Ceph, no Rook, no Longhorn. There's a lot of things that we intentionally decided not to do to minimize the complexity of operating a solution like that. And we were able to find nice trade-off spots that we could land by paying attention to what the business really needed and then thinking really hard about like, yeah, it'd be really cool to have a story about running 3,500 Ceph clusters. Somebody probably want to hear about that, but like we don't want to do that because that actually probably creates more of a risk than a reward. And so I feel like we made a lot of smart trade-offs in our solution that maybe they'd be embarrassing to talk about in the cloud world, but like for us at the edge, I think they were really smart things to settle on. That's a good example, is the persistence thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of keeping it simple, and at least from my own perspective, I think it's kind of interesting. I think people love to complain about Kubernetes, but I think it's matured a lot. I don't think it's actually particularly difficult to use, at least from my perspective. And if you're doing what you're saying, and you're keeping it simple and just using some stock stuff as a container scheduling system, it seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah,
it's not that much to talk about. It's pretty lightweight.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think has surprised me, and I wanted to know if it's still true, because I think I was talking to someone who is working at like banking, and I'm sure it applies to your situation as well, is that you would think in 2026 that the connectivity in the type of stores that you're dealing with would be very good. But my understanding is that that's not actually true. And like, why is that? Is it just that like getting commercial grade connectivity in these random locations is just not possible still, and that's why you have to do all this backup stuff with different types of connections? I don't know, just I actually would love to learn more about kind of the realities of like getting connectivity to these places. And then I think part of what really interests me is, as you go in this hub and spoke model, obviously from a cloud perspective, you have like a central operations mechanism. Like you're almost operating effectively like 3,000 to 4,000 little mini data centers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like you have to monitor those. Hardware breaks, you've got to send someone there and swap out the thing. And then I don't know. So just with what you can share, would love to even learn from an edge computing perspective, like how you deal with the connectivity aspect. I would imagine, based on what you said, that if you have a major hardware failure in one of these restaurants, it could be like a local restaurant ending event until it's fixed. It's like, how do you deal with those aspects? Just because like you can keep the software as simple as possible, but if you have a catastrophic hardware failure, you're also in a bad situation. So I would imagine that you have some level of redundancy, cross connectivity and compute and all of those things. Just would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, great question. So the why connectivity thing, I'm not an expert on, but a couple postulations and a few things I've observed. One, I think like new places where development is happening, like new suburbs, things like that, you tend to see like good connectivity come a little bit later. Like sometimes if there's not already a big footprint, you may not have fiber to the area. So that's one thing, like early in life cycle, I think it's still very difficult. It's become a lot easier, I think, for us to get good quality connections, across the vast majority of restaurants, but you still have like those events that happen. Like we already mentioned, like the local event where somebody cuts the fiber line, or maybe it's that your in restaurant, fiber infrastructure part, like the thing it connects to, that can break. You could have the sort of cascading failures where something happens at a regional or like more of a local hub, with one of the providers, and so you have an outage because of that. So like it still happens, and it happens all the time. And I think it's just a function, just like I think you and I have talked about with mobile devices before. It's like you think it's all going well, but like the actual edge experience of a user, it may not be good for a slew of reasons. You think like cell connections pretty much always work, but sometimes, something goes wrong and they don't. So I think we just deal with that to some extent as well. So being able to be resilient to that stuff and just sort of like keep on going. Obviously, there's degradations that do happen, but that's really important. But then you hit on another thing, which is big, which is software complexity is one thing. But when you deal with, physical things in the physical world, like hardware that is easy to forget about if you only work in the cloud, that stuff breaks sometimes, and you've got to be resilient to it. I mean, we run 3 devices per restaurant from a compute perspective, and already mentioned Cube basically is responsible for scheduling workloads across those, using them all when they're all available, and moving things around. If something fails, that's the primary reason for it. And then you've got similar at the network level for us. So like LAN connection is like super important. So we actually have, HA from like a routing and switching perspective. So like our 3 devices are actually across 3 different switches that are balanced across 2 different routers with 2 different connections.
Interesting. Yeah.
So pretty, like, you wouldn't expect that, I guess, for like a fast food restaurant, right? But like,
no, it makes sense. Makes sense.
Pretty big investment in that tier. I mean, it's not free, but that's good. So we've got stuff like that. So more resilience there. And then on the connection side, multiple connections. But you do still have failures, or you could have a power surge that breaks a bunch of stuff. So we still try, and if you think about user experience from whatever it is that the user is looking at or touching, and work your way back, we build as much like graceful degradation in close to the user as possible, and work our way back, and just what can you not handle, push it back a step. Can you handle it there? No, push it back a step, and sort of work from that user, I would say, back up towards wherever the thing needs to go. So
makes sense. I guess tell us a bit more then, since we started to talk about it, like how do you know if something is broken? Because as we said, you have a lot going on, right? I mean, you have the customer apps, you have the apps that the employees are using, you have, I'm sure, point of sale machines. Like, I mean, you have a lot going on within the kitchen. Would love to learn more about. Yeah, I mean, it's like, how do you monitor the system? Like, how do you understand if things are actually working well? Because I think, again, many people out there who are listening, they have a good understanding of, oh, I've got my cloud service, I'm going to put some observability or monitoring on that. And I think when you get into the edge and the mobile world, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast, things get a lot more complicated. And I think your situation is more complicated than most. So would love to learn about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly still a challenge. Like, I'm going to hand wave at all things like cloud, because I think that, like you said, that's pretty well known. But when it comes to like the physical restaurant edge site, things are still complicated, and there's still a lot of challenges. So, like, I think it's very common for the business data coming out of any given application to be, 2, 3, 5, 10x eclipsed by the operational telemetry necessary to support the same thing. And, typically in the cloud, it's like, whatever, you're paying some money to store that stuff, but maybe not a big deal. Maybe it's worth it. But when you're dealing with like, 3,500 locations and the connection and bandwidth challenges we talked about, like, our bandwidth is pretty decent, but a lot of it is carved off for very specific purposes already, like credit cards and inbound mobile orders. So there's only so much that's really available, for general use, and sending huge amounts of telemetry can break things. Like, I've told this story numerous times before, but in the early days of our Edge platform, one of the first things that we found was we actually broke credit card processing one time, hence the current segmentation, with too much telemetry flooding the pipe.
Love that story. I mean, and that story is not uncommon. I mean, that has happened to me. It's a very common issue. So, anyway,
it's hard.
Sorry,
so, I mean, we invented some stuff that worked for us, like using logging pipelines, because we have a whole like fan in the restaurant, right? Like, you mentioned tablets and devices running local applications. And I mentioned like IoT stuff earlier, fryers, grills, et cetera. Like, things can happen to those, or the software on those as well. And we care about a lot of that stuff because it can be useful to deal with an issue before it gets, before a fryer is completely broken or something and impacts operations. So there's a bunch of data that we care about. So we have to fan in not just what comes from applications running on those edge computing nodes, but actually everything else in the restaurant, or most of the other things in the restaurant. So we've got to fan in. So we have a whole bunch of data that we have to deal with. And we can't just send it all out, and we don't know what matters. So we typically say we're going to send out errors. And so logging error events typically, or, predefined metrics that we try to get people to like scope down. So we're trying to do like behavior change on people to get them to deal with more first class metrics instead of just shipping a bunch of logs. And then we can basically say, oh, based on the errors that we're seeing from this particular location or set of locations, let's like turn on more logging and bring back more specific stuff from specific apps. But we had to like, we use Vector. Then I talked about this before, but we had to roll that stuff, that whole solution ourselves. And it just feels like, 2025, end of 2025, like that would be, we wouldn't have to do that, but we did it. So it's still challenging. Like the reality of like, you really just want to know what you need to know when you're dealing with the edge, but you don't know what it is until something's happened. I think that still remains like a challenge. I know one that you're.
Do I have a product to sell you? No. I mean, you were talking about that. And to be honest, if we ever did an ad for Bitdrift, I would just have you record what you just said. I just, it is a very real problem. And I think it's useful for folks, even apart from the Bitdrift side. I think it's really interesting just to hear about the challenges that people are still facing, because I think a lot of people really don't understand. Sorry, they come from the server world, which is what you said, right? Where effectively these days, the way most developers think is bandwidth is unlimited, storage is unlimited, and for all intents and purposes, it just doesn't fail, right? And still, in this day and age, when you're in the mobile edge world, none of that is true. I mean, it fails all the time. Bandwidth is limited. So I think it's super interesting just to learn how people have kind of dealt with these challenges.
I mean, I think we came up with a decent solution, but like it's still hard, and it sounds simple. It's like, well, you have good connections. Why don't you just pay more to up your bandwidth or whatever? But it's like, you remember every number you add is multiplied by 3,500.
Yep.
It can get really expensive to operate certain types of solutions across that kind of footprint. And ours is still growing. Like, we're still expanding and opening new restaurants every year. So that like number in front of whatever we're talking about adding from a dollar perspective, that multiplier just keeps getting bigger too. So I think, just infinite bandwidth is just not tenable in this kind of distributed environment. Just doing it all locally and putting a giant storage array or something there, like building S3 in every store, ain't happening, not happening. So just like there's operational realities you just have to accept when you're going to work at this type of edge that you have to navigate. So obviously I'm a fan of what you guys are doing and thinking about.
Would love to pivot a bit just to learn about like what is on your radar currently? Just, from a technology perspective, I would also imagine that as the chief architect, you're dealing with internal productivity things of the engineers that work at Chick-fil-A. So just would love to learn more about what are the big challenges, that you're working on right now, or what are some of the things that you're looking towards in the next few years?
Well, I feel like you tried to set me up to say AI, Matt.
No. We like definitely don't have to talk about AI. I'm
happy to. Yeah. Like I think that's a reality, right? Like there's a lot of business interest in it everywhere. It's in the news all the time. It's like practically all people can talk about. I can tell you, like, personally, what I'm excited about with it is actually on the software engineering side of things. Like, and not that it's magic or anything like that, but I feel like if you can get good at kind of wielding the tools and get really good at asking them to do discrete tasks, there's lots of ways to do this. We could talk about it, but if you can get good at asking them to do discrete tasks, then I think you can actually get a ton of benefit out of the AI, like coding tools in particular. Like I'll transition over for a second to the nonprofit moonlighting stuff I do. Like I probably get 30 hours a week behind Claude Code at the moment for that. And I get like tons of great stuff done, but I had to put like the energy for me isn't into thinking about how every line of code is going to get written, but it instead is effort that goes in on the front end into thinking about not like the giant spec of everything that's ever going to exist, but this one thing I'm trying to work on right now, like how should it work? So bringing an architecture mindset to it and then letting it write some code and some tests and then, putting eyes on it and evaluating it and then like iterating. But I mean, same for Chick-fil-A. I can't go into as much about that, but like, I feel like that's going to be just a huge opportunity and one of those places where I don't think AI is actually overhyped. I think maybe it's on par. Like, I think in the software engineering space, it's going to be really helpful if people can figure out how to do that discrete task creation part effectively with a good architecture mindset and enough context in their head to give context to the AI opportunity. So I'd say that's one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have, just for my own personal use, I feel like I have crossed the I have crossed the barrier where I haven't used Claude Code, but I'm now using Sonnet 4.5 with VS Code, and some of the results I've gotten recently in agent mode are very good. I mean, it's like, and it's definitely what I've learned is that you have, just like you said, you have to learn how to use the tool. It is a tool, and it can produce very bad results, but if guided well, it can do very well. And I've been actually very impressed recently in terms of some of the output that I've been getting.
Yeah, and I feel like some of it's picking the right problems too. Like if it's this,
I agree.
like, I mean,
Yeah.
I imagine if you were working on, some really like core element of Envoy, which I'm not familiar with the code base, but like you'd probably want to like massage things to perfection because this is something that just sees like incredible amounts of load and things like that. So like optimization matters. And I'm
Yep.
not saying it can't do that at all, but I feel like in those cases you choose to be really involved. But like when you're doing web apps and stuff like that, I feel like if you can give it a good task, it's like maybe it's not 100% optimal, but in a lot of cases, when you have a few thousand users or something, or 100 users or whatever, does that even matter? So I sort of feel like there's also this, like, do you know the problem you're working on, like architecturally, but do you also know how to think about it as like how much attention to detail actually matters for it to get to a good working final
Yeah.
state? And I feel like you can kind of make your choices a little bit based on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, what we found at Bitdrift is that it is actually really good at working on low level code. It just has to be guided a lot. It's like basically what you said, which is, and I think this is where people go wrong, or probably are going to go very wrong within the industry, is just to trust what it outputs. But I think I think even in a high reliability production environment, as long as you're willing to review the code like you would review any other code, and then you can guide it along the way, at least what we've seen is that, when tasks are very targeted and you can work on a self-contained piece, the results with the new models are good. Yeah, I mean, it is good, but it's a tool like any other.
Yeah.
So
And I agree. I'm doing a lot of stuff on like an edge computing system for my nonprofit, and it's low level system stuff. And I am having success with it. And I agree, you just have to guide it more. But I think there's like little certain parts where it's like this is so important that it's really really good that I'm gonna like get a little bit more hands on with it. So it's kind of like a little bit of a spectrum is more what I'm trying to say.
yeah, for sure. So is AI the only thing that you are thinking of right now, or are there other things from an organizational perspective or a productivity perspective or anything else that you'd like to share?
I think it's a hot topic, but I think a lot of the same stuff, like, that is always true is true. Like still, helping people focus on simplicity and not just add new layers and new abstractions and new things. Like I think it's a real industry challenge. I don't remember the exact name of the talk, but there was a KubeCon talk this year about like taming the complexity beast or something that I really resonated with. And like, there's a lot of approaches that can be really great architecture, but that exact same architecture applied in a different organization or to a different problem is actually really bad architecture. Like take, Netflix microservices and apply it to your thing that has 50 users. Not great. And so I think there's a lot of that, like this is the cloud paradigm is doing all of this stuff, like not just using cloud, but like bringing all of the things that anyone ever thought about doing in the cloud to every single app that we're like starting to, we're guilty of that, we'll say in places. So this like push to intentionally not add to that and be really thoughtful about what incremental things do become part of the stack. And then also like opportunities for simplification, like radical simplification, in places as well. So I think there's some of that, like undoing a bit of the, like cloud native thinking is great, but I think part of cloud native thinking was like, you need to do all this stuff that you don't actually often need to do. And so it's like untangling that a bit and getting people to think a little bit differently, especially with a lot of our like solution architect folks and stuff like that. I mean, they're feeling the same thing. So I think that like drive to simplicity is really big. And then, yeah, I guess the other stuff is like a lot of the same. It's like trying to build, solid applications, deal with the consequences of global, AWS region outages or Cloudflare outages or all the other things everybody else is behind that take the whole internet down, and all the security stuff that's always going on everywhere. So I think it's a lot of that stuff that's maybe just like what we all deal with, but trying to minimize how much of it we have to care about.
Yeah. Well, I
So
mean, even on that one, it's like we have these giant outages, and I think recently we've had three. We had the giant Cloudflare outage, there was an Azure one, and there was an AWS one.
yeah.
But these things happen like every 5 or 6 years at this
Mhm.
point. And it is, to me, a really interesting question as to, just from a business perspective, it's like, obviously you all, I'm sure, have to ask yourself, how much effort would go into making yourself resilient to one of these outages versus how often they actually happen. And to me personally, it's not a slam dunk that you should drop everything and go and like fix this thing for what is an event that is very rarely going to happen. So.
Yeah, it's like planning for black swan events. I'm not saying they're black swans because they do happen, like you said, periodically, but that's more my worry, is that people seem to think like, now that we've had this great experience in the cloud over time where everything just kind of works until suddenly it doesn't, I think that's become so expected. Like every outage is like, what? An outage? That never ever happens. This is terrible. We must do everything to make sure that never happens again. And so I think like as an industry, we're sort of like getting ping ponged around by each outage and then making potentially architecture decisions
I agree.
off of
Yeah.
those events. And I think that's a really unwise thing to do. Maybe there are things that make sense to consider having in not the main regions that have issues sometimes, like, or use a second one as a standby or something. But I guess what I'd say is like some of the old school patterns of just like a hot standby or something for the worst case emergency might still be totally fine. You may not need to be multi-region, multi-cloud HA all the time and deal with all of the complexity and then subsequent outages that come from deciding to use that architecture.
Right. I mean, it might be fine, or you might not even want to have that cost. I mean, it's really
Right.
up to the business. But what I always find really humorous about this conversation is that I think for almost every organization that is not a giant one that has, that is willing to incur the complexity, you're going to incur more outages and downtime trying to build like an HA multi-region situation than you will from the outages that will occur every 5 to 6 years.
Yes.
And I think people just don't don't think about that. And I think, on this topic, I'll just say briefly, because I was laughing while we were talking about like simplification, is that I think people always think, because I did Envoy, it's like Bitdrift must use service meshes and microservice architecture. It's like, no, we are a monolith, zero service mesh, keep it simple. So anyway, but
and like I'm finding myself when I'm building things right now, building monolith first. And if there's a need to split off something like special, then so be it. But like, I like Go, but I build a lot of the things in Go, and then I'm like, oh, this should just be a shell script. And it's like, I think there's not everything needs to be a really highly decomposed, highly scalable, super elegant looking solution. It's like sometimes the really scrappy, simple stuff that we've been doing for 30 years, like actually works better. And it's because it's simpler. It works better because it's simpler. And I think that just like that's a mindset that I'm hoping to propagate, inside of our organization. And I think a lot of others are on that journey right now too.
Perfect. I could not think of a better way to end the episode. So thank you, Brian. This was a fantastic chat. I think people are really going to enjoy it. So that's a wrap for this episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes. Huge thanks to Brian for joining and sharing his story. You can find this episode and all past ones on the Bitdrift YouTube channel. And if you had fun, drop us a review, tell your friends, or yell your favorite hot take into the void. Just make sure to tag us. I'm Matt Klein, and I'll see you next time.